Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to set some context for studying the life of David Brainerd and studying David Brainerd as a subject. Uh, the period in which David Brainerd ministered and a lot of the major pivotal events that occurred in his life span the Great Awakening period of the 1730s and 40s in colonial New England. And so, what we'll do is we'll look at some of that context today, just for you to see the religious ethos in which David Brainerd lived. When we talk about the Great Awakening, we're talking about a spiritual awakening, and it was characterized by revivalism, and there was a heavy emphasis on evangelical conversion. In order to facilitate conversion, preachers would use a methodology that was called the Jeremiad. They would preach a certain kind of sermon that we characterize and call the fire and brimstone sermon. These sermons were the kind of sermons that were meant to give people a deep sense of their fear of damnation. All of this was towards the goal to produce a sincere affection towards God. When we talk about the major markers or the characteristics of the Great Awakening, there are three things that we typically talk about. There's this heavy emphasis on the preaching, which the Jeremiah preaching I just shared with you about. Also, a dramatic pious change. And these dramatic pious changes uh, were sometimes demonstrated by an emotional affection or response, but in general, this dramatic pious change needed to have a perseverant effect to it. There had to be a enduring aspect to this alteration. Uh, One of the things that was disappointing about the Great Awakening for many of the preachers, like Jonathan Edwards, who had a local pastoral function to their revivalistic ministry, is they saw the declension or the decline of the revival, and to them that was somewhat a discouragement that there had been a lukewarmness that developed or occurred. The other major characteristic of the Great Awakening was the conversion narratives. Uh, a Faithful Narrative was one of the major publications that preceded and helped stimulate the Great Awakening. The Faithful Narrative was published by Jonathan Edwards in 1737. It was then spread throughout New England and throughout England. In fact, it was first published in London before it was published in Boston. And that particular publication gave an account of a local narrative for the communities that are in the Connecticut River Valley. And in that faithful narrative, Edwards included a few personal testimonies that were meant to facilitate and stimulate conversion. So these conversion narratives were extremely significant. Uh, Regarding the Great Awakening, Thomas Kidd has said that there is a spectrum by which people responded to the events of the awakening. On one end were the anti-revivalists, revivalists who dismissed the revivals as religious frenzy or enthusiasm. In the middle were the moderate evangelicals who supported the revivals at their outset but became concerned about the chaotic, leveling extremes that the awakenings produced. Finally, on the other end were the radical evangelicals who eagerly embraced the Spirit's movements even if social conventions had to be sacrificed. Jonathan Edwards is one of those moderate evangelical revivalists. Charles Chauncey would be considered one of the major anti-revivalists, and then you have a number of significant individuals that come into play. Gilbert Tennant and James Davenport, of which are probably the most noteworthy, that would be called the radical revivalists. All right, so let's look at a little bit of a timeline that gives us a depiction of some major events that took place for the Great Awakening. First of all is that 1735 Connecticut River Valley Revival, which Jonathan Edwards publishes his account in London in 1737. In 1739, Gilbert Tennent preaches his Danger of an Unconverted Ministry. This sermon ends up being a very significant and important sermon. This will give you just a little bit of a snapshot of it. He says in The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry, the most likely method to stock the church with a faithful ministry in the present situation of things, the public academies being so much corrupted and abused generally, is to encourage private schools or seminaries of learning which are under the care of skillful and experienced Christians, in which those only should be admitted who upon strict examination have, in the judgment of a reasonable charity, the plain evidences of experimental religion. Pious and experienced youths who have a good natural capacity and great desires after the ministerial work from good motives might be sought for and found up and down in the country and put to private schools of the prophets, especially in such places where the public ones are not. Now, when he's talking about the public ones, he's primarily talking about Harvard and Yale, and Tennent was very critical of Harvard and Yale and those two schools' faculty. In fact, when George Whitefield comes the following fall in 1740, he does a 6-week revival tour, and he preaches both at Harvard and Yale, and he's had personal conversations with Gilbert Tennent. He's aware of the Danger of an Unconverted Ministry sermon, and he also rebukes Harvard and Yale, and as a result, these universities start to create rules in regard to disciplinary actions for anyone who undermines the authority of the leaders. So in September of 1741, Yale's college trustees created a decree that if somebody is to say something that undermines the authority and the spirituality, and particularly maybe says something that might dismiss someone who is a rector or a faculty member or a tutor, if they dismiss their conversion or deny that the person might be converted, they would be handled accordingly with strict disciplinary methods. In 1741, on the very same day, Edwards preaches a commencement lecture called Distinguishing Marks of a Work of the Spirit of God, and in that sermon, he is very affirming of the revivals, and in some way he supports the messages that Gilbert Tennent and George Whitefield have given to Yale and Harvard, and that kind of stimulation that Edwards produces is one of the things that actually led to David Brainerd's being expelled from Yale. David Brainerd is expelled from Yale because he refers to one of his tutors as being as likely to be as converted as a chair that was in the room that was with him. And a conversation that was a private conversation between him and a couple of his schoolmates became known and made known to the rector, and he went underneath these disciplinary measures and he was dismissed from the school, which was a huge blight upon his ministerial career and his prospects and his hope, and it was maybe the most discouraging, depressing moment of his life. In 1741, Edwards delivers the sermon Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That sermon is one of the sermons that continues to keep the revival fires going after Whitefield has left in the fall of 1740. In 1743, Charles Chauncey, one of the critics of the revival, writes his book, Seasonable Thoughts on the State of Religion in New England, which is actually a response to Jonathan Edwards' work, Some Thoughts Concerning the Revival of Religion in New England, where he criticizes Edwards' methodology for discerning a true revival of religion, What Edwards ends up doing is in 1747 he publishes Religious Affections, and Religious Affections is in some ways a combination of distinguishing marks and some thoughts concerning the revival that are taken to an individual, where an individual can practice some discernment and some diagnosis about their affections and whether they're demonstrating true affections that are reasonably correspondent to the revival that's taken place in their heart, or if they're demonstrating behaviors that some people have said are positive behaviors that demonstrate revival, but are actually negative behaviors. And what that means is it neither demonstrates nor does it indicate that there is no conversion either. And then a very significant publication that's for the sake of this course is The Life of David Brainerd, which is published in 1749, which is a form of conversion narrative that's being used to hopefully re-stimulate and encourage people to continue to reflect on their own life. In many ways, what it is it's an exemplar of someone who has true religious affections. And so the Life of David Brainerd takes religious affections and gives a model for people to say, oh, that's what true religious affections looks like. All right, so just to give you a little bit more about Jonathan Edwards himself and who he is, because he is the main editor of David Brainerd's diary and journals. So Jonathan Edwards began his preaching ministry after he concluded his studies at Yale in 1722, where he occupied the pulpit of a Presbyterian church in Manhattan. Now, Jonathan Edwards was a Cambridge platform Congregationalist, and so this was not the perfect fit for him, but he actually demonstrated an inclination towards Presbyterianism throughout his entire ministerial career. He had pen pals, correspondents that he wrote with across the Atlantic in Scotland that were Presbyterians, in which he said very sympathetic things about Presbyterianism. Well, anyway, he leaves that ministry in Manhattan, and in 1726 he's called to Northampton after he's been a tutor at Yale for a bit. And when he's called to Northampton to assist his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, he is then married to Sarah Pierpont within a year. In December of 1734, he is a significant person that is documenting the Connecticut River Valley Revival, which is then published as a faithful narrative in 1737. We've already talked about the publication of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and so I won't say anything more about that. But in the spring of 1744, there was this bad book episode in his ministry in Northampton, Connecticut. His grandfather had passed away, and he had been installed as the pastor for many years by this time. Actually, it was in the late 1720s, 1729, where Edwards became the sole pastor of this church. Well, in 1744, so after about 15 years of very involved ministry, there were a number of boys that were looking at a midwife book and making fun of girls in the community and their human anatomy. And Jonathan Edwards executed a disciplinary process with these young boys, these teenage boys, and in the process, some of the families that were implicated shouldn't have been implicated, and it ended up becoming a pox upon his ministry, and he was never really able to recover some of the social capital that he needed with particular people of influence within the community. And so in 1750, in June 22nd, 1750, he actually ends up being discharged from his ministry in Northampton, mostly because of some of the mechanisms that he was putting in place in order to discern the conversion of his congregants and to make sure that they were qualified to take the Lord's Supper, to be a communicant